Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the rapid demographic transformation happening right now inside Canada's federal prison system. We're going to stick strictly to the data, looking purely at the numbers to understand exactly how the makeup of male inmates has shifted over recent years. It's a really fascinating look at a system that's completely in transition. Let's get right into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We've got shifting male prison demographics, the fastest growing demographics, comparing the prison population to the general public, and finally, stark demographic disparities. So starting off with Section 1, shifting male prison demographics.
You know, if you really want to understand how any system operates, you have to look closely at the actual people inside of it. So how has the male prison population shifted over an 11-year period? Well, over this specific window of time, the faces within Canada's federal prisons have undergone a pretty vivid transformation, literally reshaping the profile of the average male inmate. When we pull up the demographics, a very clear divergence emerges. The population of white men in custody, which historically has been the majority demographic, actually dropped by 15%. But as that specific group shrinks, we're simultaneously seeing some really significant growth across other minority populations.
Which brings us right into Section 2, the fastest-growing demographics.
Now this brings us to a frankly remarkable data point, 76%. That is the jaw-dropping growth rate of Arab and West Asian men in custody over this exact 11-year period, making them the single fastest-growing male ethnocultural group. Now, to be perfectly objective, national census data does project this demographic to be among the fastest-growing in the general public as well. But still, a 76% growth rate inside the federal system? That really highlights just how rapidly the institution itself is shifting.
Moving right along to Section 3, prison versus the general public. To really understand the context behind these growth rates, we need to establish a mathematical baseline. So we're using 2016 baseline data to ask who is actually entering the system compared to the everyday people walking down the street. Think about it this way. If a prison system perfectly mirrored its host country, the demographic percentages inside the walls would match those on the outside exactly. But as we're about to see, that is absolutely not the case.
Just look at the mathematical disparity here. Black men make up just 3.4% of the general Canadian public. But within the federal prison system, that number jumps up to 9.1% for men in custody. That is almost triple their statistical footprint in the general population.
So, what this represents is a substantial statistical overrepresentation. The key takeaway you should really walk away with here is that the demographic makeup of the prison population simply does not mirror the general public. It's just a factual reality that certain demographics are entering the system at a highly disproportionate rate compared to their total population size outside the walls.
And that leads us to Section 4, stark demographic disparities. We actually see an even wider baseline gap when we look at this next group. Indigenous men represent a relatively small fraction of the general Canadian public, just 4.8%. Yet, they make up a massive 25% of all men in federal custody. Honestly, the gap between 4.8% on the outside and 25% on the inside is just a profoundly stark statistical contrast.
Putting that into perspective, this means a full quarter of the entire male federal inmate population is comprised of Indigenous men. When you picture the system as a whole, 1 out of every 4 male inmates belongs to a demographic that makes up less than 1/20th of the country's general public. Out of everything we've looked at today, it is by far the widest divergence from the baseline in our analysis.
So reviewing these completely unbiased statistics, the changing landscape of Canada's prison system is incredibly clear. We have a shrinking white male demographic, down by 15%. We see rapid, 76% growth among Arab and West Asian men. And we observe significant statistical overrepresentations of Black and Indigenous men when we measure them directly against their share of the everyday public. The system is changing, and it is changing fast.
Having walked through this purely factual baseline comparison, we're really left with a pretty provocative question, right? How will these accelerating demographic disparities shape the future of Canada's federal prison system? You know, the data gives us the objective reality of who is currently inside, but it's up to us to consider what these changing demographics actually mean for tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and as always, keep questioning the data.